Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from, and welcome to today's webinar, Ensuring Product Safety, Accreditation, and Regulatory Compliance Using Laboratory Information Management Systems, aka LIMS. My name's Amy. I'm a member of the marketing team at Perry Johnson Registrars Food Safety, Inc., and I'll be facilitating today's webinar and offering technical support to our panel of speakers. Today, we're excited to be welcoming a panel of industry experts for today's discussion, and we'll be introducing them to you all shortly. But before we get started, I want to go over a few brief housekeeping notes. To ensure audio quality, all of our attendees today are on mute. However, we do absolutely want to take any questions you might have. So to ask a question, you can just go ahead and type it into the questions tab of the GoToWebinar control panel on your screen and click send. We'll answer as many of these as we have time for at the end of the panel discussion. You do not have to wait until the end of the show to submit those questions. So as you think of them during the discussion, please feel free to send them in so you don't forget them. Some of the most frequently asked questions we get are usually regarding a recording of the webinar or the availability of slides. And I'm happy to say the slides from both today's webinar and our previously recorded webinars are available on our website at pjrfsi.com. And the recording of today's webinar, including the voiceover with all of our panelists, as well as all of our previous webinars, those recordings are available on our YouTube channel for review or to share with someone who may not have been able to attend live. So this is just what it might look like on your screen. To open the question tab, you'll click that little triangle on the left-hand side of that bar on your menu. It should open up to something like this, and you can just type that question right in that lower box and click send. Like I said before, we will get those on our end, and we will answer as many as we can in the time we have available. All right, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our moderator for today, and that's Paul Demarin. He's our Senior Vice President of Food Safety and Supply Chain here at PJRFSI. He joined us in January of last year and has over 35 years of experience in the hospitality, service, and retail agri-food sectors. Paul is also a board member of the OFPA, that's the Ontario Food Protection Association. He's also an advisory council member with the George Washington University School of Business for their digital marketing certificate program. Before he came to us at PJRFSI, Paul worked for 17 years in the certification industry with clients in every sector from food safety and supply chain to brand protection and quality. Paul has worked for many years in management system certification as well. And before that, Paul was a professional chef and a consultant for over 20 years. So Paul, I'm going to hand things over to you and you can take it away when you're ready.
Great, thanks, Amy. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. I want to welcome you and thank you very much for giving us your time. I'm extremely thrilled to welcome and introduce our panel of experts and speakers today. Orbis Lab Systems provides implementation and support services for the Laboratory Information Management Systems, LIMS, and Perry Johnson Laboratory Accreditation, which is a different company from ours. And they provide laboratory accreditation services to companies globally. So with that, let's jump right into our session here. And I'm going to start by introducing our panel of experts and have them give us a very short overview of their business. Following that, we'll have a panel discussion, and near the end of it, we'll open it up for audience Q&A. So with that, let me first start by introducing Tracy Saracen. Tracy is the president of Perry Johnson Laboratory Accreditation, or PJLA, and has been for the past 15 years. She previously worked with PJR for 6 years as the audit logistics manager and has over 21 years of quality management, customer relation, and operation management experience. She's also the director for PJLA's quality management program operation and marketing for the US and globally. She also sits on several committees throughout the ILAC, APAC, and NELAC Institute, or TNI, and the ACIL. She has a bachelor degree in general business and human resource management and a general science degree. Welcome, Tracy. Now I'm going to introduce Jay. Jay Bana. She is a registered professional scientist with the Health Professions Council in South Africa. She's a senior partner at Africa Technical Consultancy and lab consultant with Orbis Lab Systems and Services. And she's been delivering science and analytical intelligence in the quality, food safety, and product integrity globally. Business relevant mitigation strategies are executed in ingredients and finished products for consumer safety and company brand and reputation, to build trust and confidence. Previously, as the lab director for Africa at Coca-Cola, Jay was responsible for the day-to-day execution of their operational excellence, technical leadership, and performance management, leading diverse teams to successful outcomes. Now I would like to introduce Russell McKenzie. Russell was the informatics director for the Coca-Cola company, responsible for their global lab systems and programs. And in 2018, Russell joined Orbis Lab Systems and has been working primarily in the pharma sector and highly regulated environments. And last but certainly not least, Michael Gannon. Michael is the managing director of Orbis Lab Systems since 2011. And besides laboratory information management systems, or LIMS, his expertise, is with lean laboratory informatics, system integration, and resource management and utilization. So first, I would like to ask you, Michael, if you wouldn't mind, just to tell us a little bit more about Orbis Lab Systems, if you would. I think you might be on mute there, Michael.
Thanks very much, Paul, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to present to you today. Orbis Lab Systems is a consultancy in the implementation of LIMS, Laboratory Information Management Systems. And as you'll have gathered from the background profile Paul has just given us, our experiences are in food, beverages, and pharmaceuticals. And we certainly look at the LIMS solution as being an enabler for automation and efficiency in the lab, but also its strong suit is in control and compliance. And so a good LIMS should embody those two, as well as being a valuable source of data for driving quality in the organization. Part of what we bring to LIMS is our ability to integrate these systems with other systems and with instruments as part of the automation. We also bring, I think, a degree of innovation to our solutions. Our delivery is very much based on a business solution and achieving goals for the customer. Finally, as a company, we are ISO 9001 accredited, and as part of our implementation services, we advise the client on ISO 17025 and how the LIMS can be used to achieve that.
Okay, that's great, Michael. And now, Tracy, I would like to ask if you could please do the same and give us a bit of a background on PJLA.
Sure. Thank you, Paul. Good afternoon, everyone. Perry Johnson Laboratory Accreditation, PJLA. We are a third-party accreditation body. We're solely owned by Perry, and we've been around since 1999. We're located similar to PGR FSI in Troy, Michigan, but we also have office and support in Mexico, Italy, and Japan, and accredited laboratories worldwide. We are globally recognized. If you notice there's the ILAC MRA mark, which is starting to be more commonly understood and known in the industry. That is our recognition group that states that we are competent to provide accreditation to various conformity assessment bodies. Conformity assessment bodies that we deal with, majority of our work is in the laboratory industry, which we utilize the ISO 17025. We also accredit inspection bodies, reference material producers, medical laboratories, and we have about 1,500 accredited laboratories or conformity assessment bodies globally, and really busy right now and continually working on growing our programs we offer and the number of laboratories we do accredit. We also, it's not listed on here, we also accredit what's called proficiency testing providers, and that's something that's new that we've done over the course of the last 12 months. I talked about ILAC a little bit. That is our general recognition for all the ISO programs we offer, but I know it'll be part of our discussion today, but one important thing to understand about accreditation is not only is it a ISO 17025 stamp of approval we're giving, it's really important to know about accreditation and how regulators rely on the services that accreditation bodies offer. So here is just an overview of our recognitions that we have. So ILAC being our international global approval in APAC or Asia Pacific. But we also have all these other programs that we involve ourselves with as an accreditation body, because these groups here, such as the DoD or the DOE, there's the FDA, all these different US regulators rely heavily on ISO accreditation to help them make decisions about whether or not they can approve a laboratory for their sector. So I just wanted to point that out, and I think we're going to talk about that later in the presentation today. Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, thank you, Tracy. I appreciate that. And again, thanks, Michael. Okay, so now we get to the exciting part of our session today. I've already introduced our panel of experts, so now I'm going to ask our speakers a series of questions that we have relating to LIMS, and then I'm going to give each speaker a couple of minutes to give us their response. As mentioned, at the end of that, we'll then open it up for audience Q&A. And again, Tracy and Jay, Michael and Russell, thanks very much for your time. We really appreciate it. So with that, let's get going and let's start with Russell. So Russell, my first question is for you. Can you help us understand what is the role of a LIMS system?
The role of LIMS. Yeah, I think I kind of boil this down to four key points. Simplistically, at a high level, LIMS systems are designed to manage both the data and the business processes related to running the lab. And then below that, we see the LIMS really as a tool that enables that full traceability. It enables automation, and it can eliminate a lot of those manual processes related to data handling that you'd typically have. In this space, in the food and beverage space, a typical implementation would focus on testing of like raw materials, in-process sampling, finished product testing, and as well as product stability. The implementation would also bring in the specifications, so that way you've got real-time spec checking during the processing, the analytical processing. But I think another critical role of the LIMS is with interfacing, and traditionally we think that as instrument integration, bringing instrument data over. We're seeing a lot more requests that we help customers bring in that third-party external lab data into the LIMS as well. So, but over time, that your LIMS becomes basically a repository of analytical data about your products and your processes that you can then use for, trending and performance metrics. So I think, in summary, I think those are the four key areas that that LIMS should bring to the business.
That's great, Russell. Thanks very much for that. And that's actually quite interesting. I mean, just the whole technology side of it as well is expanding a great deal in our industry today. So certainly some important things to think of there. And now, Michael, from what I've heard, there's a general belief that implementing a LIMS system can be, and sometimes is, very time consuming. Do you find that this is really the case out there? Maybe give us your thoughts on that. I think you're on mute again, Michael.
I think historically that has been a perception, but there's no logical reason for it, and certainly our track record disproves that perception. And I think just to follow up on Russell's point, when you think about what a LIMS does, it manages the sample cycle, it manages the test execution, it captures the results, it makes them available for review and available for reporting. And so, when you get down to those blocks, if you will, there's quite a lot of similarity between a lot of labs across different verticals. And there's a lot of functionality there these days in the LIMS products that comes out of the box to do just that. Where I see the challenges are, and where I think historically there have been challenges with projects, is firstly not having a clear set of business requirements, a user requirement specification coming into the project. It's very important that you're clear about what you want, and the vendor has been upfront with you as to how you'll get that functionality. That is one key issue that manages that perception. The other one is, if you think about it, The people in the lab, and a lab is a procedurally driven environment, they're going to do a lot of their work through the LIMS system. It's going to become a way of life for them. And I think projects have underestimated the adoption time needed and the coaching needed for the users in making that transformation. We talk about digital transformation. It's brilliant, it's powerful, it takes away paper, it gives you information to do wonderful things. But unless your users can have ease of use and a facility with that system, you don't get those benefits. So I major on two issues really is the requirements, and then testing and proving that they've been delivered, and then the adoption, the second point being the adoption of the technology by the user community.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, Michael, in my space, in the food safety and supply chain, I mean, typical implementation, if a company's not working with a consultant, is usually 6 months to a year. Is that similar for?
That's typical, but just to put it in context, the core build in that time frame to actually build the system and populate it can be 4 months. It can be half that time. Right. What drives the longer timeline is, you know, it's an organic process. People getting to know each other, getting the requirements right, the testing that's needed, the training that's needed. And if you don't have those requirements addressed, and it's only discovered late in the cycle during testing, well, you're going to go off your timeline straight away. So, you know, you can shorten those tails and squeeze this timeline. We've delivered systems in 6 months or less, depending on the level of testing required. But typically, you know, if you're planning a sizable project, you will take a year. You've also got to allow for the fact that you're asking users to test the system, and they have to do that with their day jobs, and they have, you know, leave to take during the implementation cycle. So these are factors which do add to the timeline. But the core of the product, I get back to that the actual build that we do as technical consultants is pretty well defined for this industry and for some of the other industries in which we work. And once you've got your requirements well defined, they can be delivered quite quickly.
Okay, great, thank you. Now, Tracy, what do you see as being one of, or if not the largest challenge for companies or laboratories when they're looking to become accredited?
Well, you know, it depends on the lab and, you know, how long they've been around, but, you know, certainly for laboratories that are new into the industry, you know, that a lot of them are very, you know, competently and technically sound, maybe in the analytical portion, you know, but they struggle a little bit with the ISO requirements, where there's quite a bit of procedures that are required, documentation, you know, writing the things down. So that's something the laboratories have to really get trained on and understand what those requirements are in order to implement those so they're ready for the accreditation. You know, from the technical area, you know, again, it's a lot of, you know, the ISO 17025 standard expects that, you know, that the results are traceable. They have to use accredited sources for their, you know, any instruments that need to be calibrated. You know, making sure that they have validated methods is really important. So PJLA is getting very involved. You know, this is going on in the food industry for some time, where there might be, you know, their own in-house developed methods, and 17025 requires that the laboratories, when they can use in-house, you know, methods, but they have to validate them, and there's a process for doing that. So that can take the laboratories some time. In the cannabis industry, we're heavily involved in that as well. That's certainly, there's not too many national methods out there for that. So that's something that might take the lab some time. We might do the assessment and let them know that the validation needs to be completed. So that could be part of the corrective action process. You know, other things, proficiency testing is another one. Many laboratories, even if they've been around for some time, they might have done repeat studies or in-house type of comparisons. With the ISO accreditation, they really should be using third-party when they're available, third-party proficiency testing providers, or comparing the results with other laboratories. You know, so really, you know, it depends on the lab, how long they've been around. You know, they need to be trained, need to understand standard. We're there to add value. We're not there to consult the lab. We hope we can, add value to make laboratories, better at the end of the day. And we can give so much input to during our assessments. But accreditation takes time. And I just did a session just earlier this week about giving laboratories a lot of credit, that have never been into this industry before. That getting ISO accreditation, is something that's not just a one-time thing. They have to maintain this, and they have to get the support from their management and from their staff in order to continue to comply, with those requirements, and again, keep up with them. It's not an easy job. So for us, for the challenges, I think that's what I would say for a laboratory, going into the process for the first time. And again, it's something that they do have to maintain. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of these laboratories, become accredited because it's a customer request. But nowadays, because regulation is really specifying ISO accreditation, they have to have this. Particularly in the cannabis industry, it's written into the state law that, that might not be the only way they get licensed, but they have to have that in order to become accredited. So it's important for the laboratories to, to understand what those ISO requirements are on top of, regulation requirements as well. So I recommend get the training, review the standard. We are more than happy if someone calls us and needs, like, they're going to be working with us, and they need, assistance with what something means. We're more than happy to give an interpretation on things. But but it's normal. I mean, laboratories that go through accreditation the first time, it's common to have anywhere from 5 to 15 nonconformities, and people shouldn't be upset about it in a way. Nonconformities, in my opinion, are a good thing. The first go around, if you continue to keep having them, you might need to step back and look what you did, make sure your corrective action that you've taken is effective. But I just think people just need to realize, laboratories need to realize that, it's a learning curve, but do your best to get prepared and take training that's available.
Great. Thanks, Tracy. And you mentioned validation a few times. So Jay, moving over to you now, can you just clarify what is method validation?
Sure. Thank you, Paul. So basically, from a laboratory perspective, as Tracy has re-emphasized, there is quite a bit from the lab side that needs to be done. And for all the tests being performed in the laboratory, one needs to look at an analytical method and the way it's being validated. So what would we mean when we say that a method is method validated? It would be that it is fit for use and it meets its intended purpose. So it is the responsibility of each individual lab and its management to ensure that the minimum requirements is followed and the fit for purpose is developed. So this is confirmation by examination and provision of objective evidence within the laboratory that a particular requirement or a specification intended by the customer and the use of it is fulfilled for the customer side or in terms of reporting for that specification or regulatory requirement.
Okay, thanks, Jay. And then just to follow up on that, what specifically should the method validation document overall? So
basically, the method validation report is actually quite important because it would look at the competency of staff. So in effect, it entails the results of the method validation work, outlining how the tests were performed, the acceptance criteria used, the scientific and statistical rationale, if there's any stats involved, justification of the acceptance criteria, and stating whether the method is in fact fit for use. It also demonstrates, in effect, the technical competence of the lab staff as you go through the different validation parameters, be it repeatability or reproducibility, which then in fact verifies or confirms the competency of lab staff working on that analytical method. And then this can also be further evaluated by doing a third-party test or intra-laboratory test. And that would be proficiency studies that again evaluates further the competency of the laboratory staff.
That's great. Thank you, Jay. I appreciate that. Tracy, just back to you for a minute. Can you talk to us a little bit about benefits of accreditation for a lab and their customers as well?
Sure. And I wanted to add something, what Jay was just saying too, that's come up recently about the method validation, and I'll jump right into that. Is that one thing too, I think laboratories need to understand with ISO 17025, method validation, there's two sections there. That method validation, if they're developing their own in-house methods, that's something they definitely obviously have to follow. But one thing I think laboratories forget too is just because you validate a method once, it doesn't mean you don't need to keep doing it again, which is called verification. So even if you buy or use an AOAC method or ISO method too, you still should verify that it's always fit for use. It's something that laboratories don't really, we found in some cases that they don't continue to verify that it's still working okay. So it's not just a one-time validation and that's it. It's something that's a very high risk. You're developing your own method. You got to make sure that you have a process or something defined that how you're going to continuously to keep verifying it. Because that's, again, something that we see as a common issue, with our laboratories, with some non-conformities when we do like surveillance visits. So just laboratories need to keep that in mind. So benefits of accreditation, again, laboratories that become ISO 17025 accredited, this is the globally recognized standard. So, laboratories should use that as a market advantage for them compared to a laboratory that, that is not. Also as an advantage too, or really, again, the benefit is that if sometimes laboratories, they have to have it, so it's going to help them with regulatory compliance. But it also, it gives the laboratories, accountability in their laboratory. They have a design system now, SOPs, requirements for record keeping. They have a corrective action process. So they have staff that now are accountable to do something, document things. And people that are using laboratories, again, that might be required by the regulation for them to become accredited. But, accreditation is not just, all about paperwork. And I know I'm stressing that a lot because it's a common issue that laboratories struggle with. But when we go in to do an accreditation assessment, our job, it's really a third-party attestation that the laboratory is demonstrated competency. So that's used a lot in our ISO standard, which is 1711 that we follow. But also it is a demonstration of competency to state the laboratory has demonstrated they can perform particular tests on what's listed on their scope of accreditation. So people that select accredited laboratories could have that assurance that they're going to get reliable, reproducible results versus someone who is not 17025 accredited.
And Tracy, again, so at a high level, what does 17025 that accreditation process? What does that entail for the labs?
So the first thing they have to do is we really, the laboratories need to tell us what they need to be accredited for. So with the 17025 accreditation, we tell people this all the time. We're required to publicize all the laboratories we accredit on our website. And the reason we do that is because regulators or customers of laboratories want to ensure the laboratory continues that competency requirement. So if you look at the back of ISO 17025 accreditations, every laboratory typically gets from their accreditation body a certificate that says that you meet the ISO 17025, now 2017 requirements for the supplement behind. So it's really important to make sure if you're using an accredited laboratory that you look at the test list, calibration list, whatever it is, to make sure that test is on there, because if it's not, they're not accredited for it. So it's up to you whether or not you're going to use them or not. But if you want them to be accredited for that test, it should appear on the back of their scope. So the first thing laboratories need to do is tell us what you want to be accredited for. So you can't just tell us I want to be 17025. You have to say, well, for what? So we have to obtain their testing list. We evaluate that test list and determine how much time we're going to need on site. So there's no, on the IAF side of the world, the certification side, sometimes there's what's called mandate grids. There is no mandate grid on our side because we look at it as how many tests, what's the commonality between those techniques, between those tests, how large is the laboratory, how difficult are those tests. So really you have to look at each lab uniquely to determine the time. So the laboratory, once that's finished, they will get a quotation as a contracting process. And once they commit to that, we can then start scheduling the on-site assessment based on their timelines and their preference. We do require a 30-day pre-documentation review because we want to make sure we do that prior to the on-site, just to make sure that we're not going to be wasting anyone's time. Once the assessment is completed, the laboratory will get a report. They have 60 days to respond to any nonconformities. Once that process is finished, we have their material go to an independent review committee. And then once that comes back to us, it's either approve or deny accreditation. If it comes back to approve, the certificate then gets issued for a two-year period. After that, a year later, they do what's called a surveillance, which is typically about a day, depending on the size of the lab. And that really is to ensure they've implemented their corrective actions from the prior year, and they're doing their annual maintenance items like internal audits and proficiency tests they're supposed to be doing. And then after the surveillance, they then are asked to renew their accreditation and go through a full system assessment again. Laboratories should expect on the on-site assessments that we want to talk to people, not just the designated quality manager, unless that is the person doing all the tests. We do have small labs, but we will be out in the laboratory most of our time. We do review quality management system documents, which is usually about a day. But the rest of the time is all spent in the laboratory talking to the people performing the test, looking at the instrumentation and looking at the data. So yeah, laboratories need to expect that everyone who is involved with that particular test should be available to participate.
Okay,
well, that
thanks.
was a lot. So.
Yeah, no, that was good though. I mean, it's all extremely important information, so thanks for that. Now, Michael, obviously that sounds like, a lot as far as implementation, but can you tell me about the investment for LIMS and cost of ownership?
So the good news is I turned my microphone on this time, and the second good news is that I'm actually going to look at this from the customer side rather than the consultancy side. I think I want to pick up on one point from both Jay and Tracy, which is the test method. I think it's important to stress that LIMS systems now have capability for executing test methods. So they have a capability to map the method process and enforce it and record the steps that have been taken. So it's possible to get to a very high level of compliance with that lab execution capability with the LIMS. The second thing is we believe that a lot of the vendors should be providing out-of-the-box method templates with their systems. It's been very slow to get that far. So I'm talking now as looking from the industry, from the outside. I think we did one, this team here actually did one last year, which was for Chronobacter. Just before the coronavirus, believe it or not. It's a food pathogen that occurs in infant milk formula, and we built a method for that. We're starting to see a lot of automation coming into micro testing, and the instrument vendors will give you the methods to build. They'll give you the guidance on the methods to build in the system. We just need the LIMS vendors to provide some of these. It would save an awful lot of time, and that would help in the implementation phase as well, because there's no reason why these methods shouldn't be executed in the same way in different companies and different labs if they're following that method. So getting back to return on investment, as your consultancy or supplier will charge for licenses and will charge from consultancy, but guess what? They will negotiate. So you've got to ensure that the vendor has the functionality to meet your system. You've got to ensure that they're capable of delivery. So you've got to do due diligence on that. And I still think a customer reference is one of the best ways of doing that. You can even give your vendor a test, ask them to build something for you as a proof of concept. They'll do it, they'll complain about it, and they'll talk about recovering their costs. But these are things you can do to get the costs down. So the license cost and the consultancy cost can be variable and can be negotiated. What you've got to be careful of is the hidden costs. Loading data is a hidden cost. The maintenance of the system, not from the external vendor, but internally, you do require somebody internally who will oversee the system, who will add new products when you want to set them up. That's time you've got to cost into your business case. The return on investment is typically 3 to 5 years. How do you measure that return? Tangible benefits are probably automation. I think removing paper, digitizing the lab, streamlining the lab processes, you can expect at least 25% return on FTEs in your lab for that. Another area, if the LIMS is implemented properly, is in the review of data, because all the data that a quality control manager or a lab manager needs to sign off on samples or on a lot can be brought together in a single interface using the LIMS, including the checks you need to do on the instruments, checks that you need to do on reagents or stock that was used. All of that can be made visible and speed that process up. If you look at doing that on paper with logbooks and managers going into the lab to bring out a logbook to check that an instrument was calibrated, that uses a lot of time on an expensive resource. So you can expect savings there. The intangible benefits. I mean, before I go off the tangible ones, one other one, which is just control. You know, control, the results are checked against the specification. It's possible to stop a problem that's appearing in the process. If you're recording that data, that can save a lot of money straight away. Intangible benefits it's a good perception for your customers that you've got this technology, that you're using it to control your process. It helps with accreditation. It helps with compliance. Compliance is probably the strongest feature on LIMS. You've got all the controls, the audit trail, the electronic signature, the chain of custody. So it's possible from a result that's outside of spec to trace back to root cause using the LIMS system. So there are significant benefits, as I said, in that 3 to 5 year timescale.
Thanks, Michael. Jay, can you tell us a little bit more about results validity?
So I think, you know, emphasizing again where Michael's come from in terms of the LIMS and some of the benefits. In terms of reporting of results, the results validity is most important for the laboratory. And how are they going to go about ensuring that the correct result has been reported? So in terms of the laboratory side, what was very much paper-based and, you know, doing quality control charts and that type of a thing, it is basically what the lab would look at is the uncertainty errors. And in a laboratory, for any test process, we would need to look at the errors associated with the test. So that would be your random and your systematic errors. Now, in evaluating the contributions for each of those errors, that would look at then the uncertainty applicable to the final result, and we need to make an estimation of that uncertainty. So in terms of the customer, when the result is reported on the certificate of analysis, there should be a conformity statement that the lab meets in terms of what the customer requires. So, you know, if we're looking at equipment and materials within the lab, we would be able to evaluate the uncertainty or error contributions from each of those and would then be able to estimate the final result and the associated error. The positive side to this is that the LIMS or the sample manager in the lab execution system allows you to plot the confidence intervals in terms of your 95% confidence when you're reporting or rechecking a test result. And what that helps you do is then assess from doing intermediate checks or quality control runs, or also running a reference material just to establish whether your system is in control. So those would be all the laboratory strategies the lab would need to use to evaluate that the result is valid before they report out to the customer. And if that result, in terms of food safety, we're looking at confirmation in terms of regulation or a country regulation where a product is being exported. This type of evaluation is quite important in terms of understanding the conformity to the customer. And LIMS does that very simply in terms of the final result, because it has taken all these estimations into consideration. It's done the conformity in terms of the interval, whether it's the 95% confidence or the 99% confidence. But it takes all those attributes into consideration, and we can be sure that the result reported is then valid for the customer to then evaluate or make a decision further, whether it's taking a product off the shelf. And in most cases, you would want to avoid any form of recall or any sort of disrepute to a brand. So that's where our results validity comes in.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's interesting. Russell, I want to come back to you here for a second now. Do you think that implementing a LIMS system, makes your lab more regulatory compliant?
I think it does, but it's all in the details. It's really comes down to, how you choose to implement your LIMS and what features and functions that you elect to use and in what manner. Traditionally, what we would see, traditional lab LIMS implementations, the customers would have really been focused on, let's say, the elements of Section 7 around sampling, verification, and reporting of results, which is helpful. But what we're seeing now is more greenfield type of implementations, where they are looking at the traditional mappings of ISO to LIMS, but they're also putting emphasis on Section 6 elements pertaining to resources and equipment, and again, external support systems and other systems. So we are seeing more users leveraging what's there out of the box. And I think most of the mainstream solutions pretty much have a significant amount of functionality to complement ISO. Even we were looking at tracking incidents through the LIMS system. So it really comes down to how you implement, what you implement, and kind of how you design that workflow that depends on would enable that compliance.
Okay, and what do you think is the typical lifespan of a LIMS system?
If it's well thought out, well designed, and it's commercial LIMS, we're seeing 10 years, 15 years. A lot of our clients are in this group where they've invested in the system, it meets the business needs, and there's no need to change. So we do recommend avoiding solutions that require what we call customization or programming. We recommend solutions that are more configuration and workflow based, where the lab can do the configuration themselves to a certain amount. Another thing is you really need to think about your future business. Think about it in terms of, we know we're testing this today, but in the future, what if we start testing a new ingredient or a new package, or we have a totally new product that we have? So you want to make sure that your LIMS is flexible to grow with the business. Just one last point. Early in my career, on a lot of these typical LIMS implementations, they would be really heavily IT computer programmers, database people, be really heavily technical focused. And what I'm seeing now is there's more of a blend on the LIMS support team. In fact, it's more people from the lab that are on the support team because they know the lab processes, they know the business. They've picked up the LIMS, they know enough, technical skills to do basic queries. So it's, I think that is helping LIMS to be supportable for longer, or leveraged by the business for longer, because you've got, people that understand the business supporting it. So,
Right.
but LIMS systems have come a long way in the past several years. So, I mean, but yeah, that's it.
All right. Thanks, Russell. Tracy, do you think, labs that have a LIMS system, do you think it makes the accreditation process go smoother for them?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, nowadays, you see most laboratories have some type of LIMS system in place. I think that it gives the assessors, the assurance too that there's going to be, less errors. They have a good process that follows with the procedure for documenting their data. Laboratories are able to retain their data and get it to us quickly, and even for their own customers' sake, it's kind of more of a secure way and a quick way for people to get their results as well, where they're able to track things quickly. And even regulation, even going back to the cannabis industry, I know that even they have some tracking systems that should connect to the LIMS systems for their own purposes to track certain samples that are going, within the states too. So no, I mean, definitely, it's nowadays, I think that if someone didn't have a LIMS system, we'd be a little concerned. We can't, write up a laboratory for not having one, but it's something that we definitely see a lot, and it definitely helps the assessors be able to assess their process a lot easier when they have something like that.
Okay, thank you. I just to make sure that we leave time for the audience Q&A, I'm just going to ask a few more questions here, and then we'll move over to there. So coming back to you, Michael, Section 6 of the standard mentions external testing services. How would you or an organization manage this using LIMS?
Okay, before I answer that, Paul, just a couple of comments, 2 comments. Agree very much with what Russell said on the scientific or the lab background for LIMS. Our company actually has a strapline of putting science back into LIMS. I'm an engineer, and I learned the hard way that you need scientists to work with you to understand the laboratory and understand laboratory processes. So it is a tool for the lab, and I've never seen a good LIMS delivered entirely by IT. So, and that does tie up with my earlier point about adoption and the hidden cost, because you do need that lab involvement. Second point is that when you're, again, going back to vendor selection, you apart from assessing the product, and a lot of companies when they buy a LIMS spend a lot of time doing that, you also need to assess the vendor, because as Russell said, these systems last 10, 20 years. We've some people on the systems we work with for more than 20 years. It's a very long relationship. And once it's in, it's not something that it will be easily removed. So you want to ensure that the supplier is somebody that will partner with your company, will respond to your needs, and will develop with your company. Addressing Section 6, that section, apart from third-party labs, it obviously a main part of it is equipment calibration. The LIMS is strong in that area. It'll control calibration, and it'll control maintenance of equipment. One area that I'm often surprised there isn't more detail on in the current ISO 17025 standard is on reagent control. I only find one word in the standard on reagents, but again, a LIMS is very strong in controlling the use of reagents. It'll control it by quantity, it'll control it by shelf life, it'll track the actual stock that was used by barcode identity. So, and again, that gives you the traceability that you need. Addressing your question directly, In the world we're living in now, we're going to see an awful lot of contract labs in the years ahead. They're growing all over the place, and there's a lot of outsourcing going on between manufacturers and contract labs. You can get the result back from your contract lab. We believe it should be done electronically for data integrity purposes. But when you're getting that result back from the lab, that helps you in the evaluation of the product. But you also need to use the data to evaluate the lab as your supplier. So you will want to do some benchmark testing against that supplier. I think you should always insist on getting the raw data from the supplier. After all, you're paying for it. And that data should be stored in your LIMS system so that it's available for trending. And if there are any issues with the lab, if there's a result that's out of spec and subsequently proves that it shouldn't be, and it's a problem at the contract lab end, well, that should be recorded as an incident or a potential deviation on the LIMS system. So you can use the system obviously to hold the data you get from that third-party lab, but you can also use it to manage the performance of your supplier, which is what that section of the standard is about.
Okay, thank you, Michael. And now, Jay, what, in your opinion, do you think are some of the biggest challenges when transitioning to the new standard or version 2017 of the standard, and where do you think they should start?
So I think, from experience looking at version 2005, it was very prescriptive. And I think labs found it very difficult to understand and how to go about getting started and, finding a purpose in terms of how to follow through. And I think the most important thing is, if one goes out to support a lab in trying to help them to get accredited, the first three things we would look at, or the simplest would be to look at the laboratory's document management system in terms of their policies, how it ties into their procedures, what are some of the customer specifications and test methods that they're looking at. Is it regulatory or is it legislative, related to government, those type of things. And then you would have forms that would be inclusive of, the additional info that you need to integrate between procedures and specifications. So that would be the one. The second would be looking at the customer complaints register. That gives you an immediate idea of where some of the non-conformances may be, where the customer may not be happy with the way you're reporting a result, or there might be really a problem in the lab in terms of the method itself and whether you meet the requirements of what the customer needs. So that's the customer complaints register. The third one would be to look at the, I would say the report, the results report. And the results report is a good place to start, especially if it's not an accredited lab. The three things we would look at would be method validation, how they estimate the uncertainty of measurement, and what sort of conformity or decision rules are used in terms of getting to that final result. And part of that traceability within the process of the lab, we'd look at the quality controls or the intermediate checks and see what strategies the lab used in terms of reporting that result. So those would be the three areas. For the staff competence, we would look at, again, proficiency testing would be one way of looking at that. So those would be, three of the major areas that we would help look at, and then write up an assessment in terms of where we found non-conformances. And that would be the start in terms of accrediting to 2017.
Okay, thank you, Jay. That was a great response. So that's going to end it for myself. I think this was an amazing session and certainly filled with a lot of very important and relevant information. At this point, I'm going to pass it over to Amy, who will now lead us through our audience Q&A. Thank you again to our speakers, and Amy, I'll pass it over to you.
Great, thanks, Paul, and thanks to all of our speakers today for some really interesting content. Just before we go into Q&A, I'm going to encourage everybody to get those questions in if you had any that you'd thought of during the discussion. But in the meantime, I'm just going to really quickly share two of our upcoming webinars that we have scheduled. You can find all of those webinars listed at pjrfsi.com/webinars, and all of them are free to register, so please feel free to join us for another session in the future. But I'm going to go ahead and open up the questions tab here and see what we've got as far as questions from the audience here. All right, we've got a question here. It's not directed to anyone specifically, so just whoever wants to take it can speak right up. This one is from Rosario, and they're wondering, how are the metrological data collected, such as metrological traceability and uncertainties?
So I think from a metrological perspective, the data would reside in terms of certificates of analysis. So if we're looking at any specific equipment, we could look at the supplier catalog, for instance. If it's a reference material, there would be a certificate of analysis. And on that certificate of analysis, you would get the uncertainty contribution on that certificate. And those values then would then be inputted into the laboratory execution system on the sample manager side, where those contributions would be added to the uncertainty estimation within LIMS.
All right, anybody else have input on that question from Rosario? All right, great. We've got another question here. This one's from Phil. Phil is asking, when choosing a LIMS system, what are the most important aspects to compare between the ones available on the market?
I think you've got to look at your own business, and you've got to have a clear view of your business process, you know, your as-is process diagrams, and you've got to look at the LIMS to see, are those features there? And the features typically are creating samples, relating samples to production batches. It should have the lab execution. It should be able to integrate instruments easily. The integration capability should be in the product, not outside of it. It should have a certificate of analysis. It should manage retained samples. It should manage lab stock. It should manage instruments, as I said. It should report easily. You should check to see that you can get the data out of the system easily for reporting or analytics. It needs to integrate into your business process. So in theory, for many companies, it could be SAP. It needs to integrate to that, or even to a process control system.
And just real quickly, I think the other thing is are you going to host the LIMS in your data center, or is it going to be a cloud-based implementation?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd add to that. The cloud is having a phenomenal effect on our industry. It's allowing small labs who buy quite small systems now, 1-2 user systems, which hitherto they couldn't do because they had to buy a server. They can now go on the cloud and pay an OPEX fee. Less capital, more OPEX, but that's how you run your business. So cloud is a real game changer.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. This one is directed at Tracy. This is from Andrew. Andrew's wondering, how does accreditation connect to regulations in the food and cannabis industries?
So, like I mentioned earlier, with accreditation, you know, it's heavily relied on by, let me talk about cannabis for a second. So with cannabis, it's still not federally legal. I know some things are being worked on, so it's a state by state preference or requirement that's now out there. I think there's about 35 states that now have some type of regulation for medical or recreational use. But with that, the states have their protocols for testing laboratories, and they will rely on the ISO 17025 accreditation as a baseline in order for laboratories to become accredited. So that's how it's, you know, connected now at this point for cannabis. I know with the USDA with hemp, there is the proposed rule that's out there where they strongly encourage the ISO 17025 accreditation, but I know that they're working on additional program requirements for the laboratories. For the food industry, the FDA has put out a proposed FSMA mandate for 17025 accreditation for laboratories. I know that's in process, it's not finalized just yet, but it's, appears based upon the latest revision that I reviewed and we commented on, is that laboratories, if you want to be an FDA, you want to play in the FDA game, you want to be an FDA laboratory, you must obtain 17025 accreditation. So certainly, like I said earlier, many regulators are relying on it. It might not be the only thing, again, we might be that baseline approval, and the regulators will do their own additional things on top of that to issue licenses or acceptance. But it's definitely, we're seeing it more and more.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tracy. I know we are right at the end of our scheduled time, but I did want to throw out one more open-ended question for the four of you. Where do you all see the future of LIMS headed? I know, Michael, you mentioned the importance of the cloud really opening things up, and Russell, any new technology on the horizon you can see coming that might really impact things in LIMS?
I think HoloLens and optical devices in use in the lab is a possibility for very advanced automation.
Right. Anything else on the technology front there before we wrap things up?
So I think labs are becoming very much more intelligent in terms of how data is collected. So if you're doing a field test or collecting a water sample and you've got a mobile LIMS, it's a lab itself in your hand. You could do some of the tests, the environmental tests, and record all the information and have it throughputed into a central data system. So it's making it much easier to maintain the integrity of samples. Similarly, if you look at lab on the chip, where it's a lab on its own outside of the laboratory itself. So there's a lot of new intelligent systems that doesn't require the lab itself. And we're looking at more intelligent systems in that sense. So LIMS will play a very central role in terms of how data is collected, centralized, and the ease of accessibility. And we're talking about cloud. It could be available anyway, whether it's an export product, unless it's a critical control point in a production process and there's been a fault at that point, or it's monitoring an environment where there's a pathogenic organism and we can stop that process and do something about it. So I think it's playing a very big part in terms of how we process and how we present safety in terms of the food chain as well.
All right, I did see a question, a short one come in here from, and I apologize if I mispronounce this name, Srinivas. The question is, are machine learning and AI going to impact LIMS improvement? And I think that's similar to what you were just saying, Jay.
So it's similar to the Internet of Things, where we're combining, artificial intelligence with machine learning, and everything is so much integrated in terms of how labs of the future are moving as well. And our technologies are much more sophisticated. We're going down to really trace levels, and it's making it really difficult, even in terms of accreditation. How do we validate? How do we keep up? Because technology is just advancing.
Absolutely. Well, thank you guys all so much for taking the time to present for us. Great discussion, some great questions going on. I just wanted to again, thank you all on behalf of PJRFSI, and Paul as well. Thank you for moderating the session. Thank you to all of our attendees for taking the time. The recording should be up on our YouTube channel probably by tomorrow afternoon. And well, we hope to see you all on a future webinar. And as I said before, those are all available on pjrfsi.com/webinars. And I hope you all have a great rest of your week and stay safe out there.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.